Now, as the name of the video implies, this is part 11 of a story, so if you haven't seen the first several parts yet, I'd highly recommend starting with part 1, and if you like it, working your way back here. Links to all previous parts will be in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start by getting a shot of the planet Jakku, before we pan up and see Darth Vader's Super Star Destroyer above the planet, along with dozens of other Star Destroyers, some of the old design, and some of a much newer one we've never seen before. We're then taken on board the Super Star Destroyer, to the bridge, where we see Grand Admiral Versio looking out at the massive fleet with an all-too-pleased grin upon her face. And standing behind her is a blue holographic image of Director Hux, who says, "I assure you, Grand Admiral, the Star Commander project has been an unparalleled success. The troops I have created are more than ready to lead the ground assault upon Coruscant, while you and your fleet eliminate the New Republic's pathetic fleet above. Soon, our empire will take its rightful place." And it's then when Grand Admiral Versio cuts him off and says, "You mean Lord Vader's empire." She then turns, regards him coldly, and says, "Don't be too proud of these abominations you've created, or should I say that Dr. Search has created, while you simply oversaw the project, Director. They are insignificant compared to the power of our Emperor, the power of Lord Vader." To that, Hux says nothing, and after giving a slight snarl, his holographic image fades away. That's when one of the bridge officers speaks up and says, "Grand Admiral, a small shuttle has just emerged from hyperspace and is asking for permission to land, and to speak with Lord Vader." Versio then looks at the officer, and she seems half amused and half confused, as the officer then goes on to say, "Records indicate that it is a Jedi shuttle, ma'am." That's when Versio frowns, turns back around to survey her fleet once more, and simply says to destroy the shuttle. The officer nods and says it will be taken care of, when suddenly a vague, shadowy blue holographic image of Darth Vader himself takes shape in the middle of the bridge, and he immediately says, "Grand Admiral, you will allow the shuttle that has just entered the system to land and bring the occupant to me." And without another word, the image of Vader fades away, and soon enough, every officer on the bridge has their eyes locked on Grand Admiral Versio, as if wondering what to do. Then after wiping away a look of slight frustration, Versio says, "You heard Lord Vader. Allow the ship to land and see to it that whoever is on board finds their way to him." That's when the scene then shifts to one of the hangar bays, and we watch as a small shuttle comes in for a landing, and waiting for it is an Imperial officer along with a small squad of stormtroopers. Soon enough, the shuttle finishes landing and a ramp lowers, and down it walks Farad, who only says, "I have come to speak to Lord Vader." And that's when we switch scenes entirely and get a shot of the Sith Temple on Malachor, before we're taken inside, where Ben Solo, with Ahsoka's lightsaber in hand and activated to light the way, leads Rey down a dark corridor. That's when we hear her say to him, "This place is massive. How are we ever going to find Luke in here? If he's even in here, that is." Ben glances over his shoulder and says, I think I can sense him." Rey sighs when she hears him say that and responds, "Why does this mean so much to you? Being a Jedi, I mean." Ben simply shrugs and then says, "It's what I'm meant to be." But to that, Rey shakes her head and reaches out, takes him by the shoulders and stops him before saying, "No, there has to be more to it than that. You can't just be obsessed with it because you feel like it's your destiny or some nonsense." Ben looks a little bit hurt by that and then replies that it's not nonsense. Rey gives a quick apology and then asks again why Ben wants to become a Jedi. That's when Ben finally gives it some quiet thought before saying, "My parents are heroes who saved the very galaxy. I just want to live up to a fraction of that." Rey gives him a small frown and then says, "I don't know much about the Jedi, but isn't that the wrong reason to want to become one?" Ben gives a small laugh, then nods a bit and says, "I suppose it is," before turning his head and looking into the darkness before them and saying, "And yet here I am now, perhaps on the verge of walking the path I've always dreamed of, the path to become a Jedi, trained by Luke Skywalker himself, who just so happens to be my uncle." Ben shakes his head in disbelief at it all, then looks over his shoulder and locks eyes with Rey before saying, "Once an adventure such as this would have been everything I'd ever dreamed of, but now I can't help but wonder if it's even what I truly want anymore, or if another life is calling to me." To that, Rey smiles, and Ben looks away rather awkwardly. He then gives something like a resolute nod of the head and says, "Nevertheless, Luke needs my help now, and I'll do what I can to save him, not to become a hero, but because it is what is required of me." We then switch scenes and find ourselves back on board Darth Vader's Super Star Destroyer and watch as Varad, escorted by 4 stormtroopers, walks down the corridor that leads to Darth Vader's chambers where, as usual, 2 Red Imperial guards stand on duty just outside the double doors. As they draw ever closer then, the stormtroopers stop and Varad walks on alone. And the double doors slide open, and without a word or movement from the Red guards, he walks right into the darkness. We then watch as Varad moves deeper into the room, looking all around him as he does, and then he looks over his shoulder briefly as the doors slide shut behind him, enveloping him in almost absolute darkness, other than a very dim red glow that allows vague shapes to be made out. And among those shapes is Darth Vader, seated in his chair-like apparatus in the middle of the large chamber. Varad then falls to a knee and extends a closed hand out towards Vader. Slowly then, he opens that hand to reveal the small stone Luke had given to him, which gives off an ever so faint golden glow. Vader then says, "Why have you come here?" Varad closes his hand around the stone and says, "You know who I am then?" Vader responds, "I know only what you were once destined to become, but that is a mantle that now belongs to me, for I am now the chosen one of the dark side." To that, Varad gives a vague nod of the head and says, "So it would seem, so it would seem. The power once wielded by the creature I was to become is now yours to command. For now. But as you already know, it is destroying you, consuming you from within, and weakening your ever-failing body. The dark side extracts its toll upon all who wield it, and it is a price that will eventually deplete the essence of any mortal being." Varad then smiles and rises to his feet and continues, "Just like those who wield it, the dark side knows only selfishness. It does what it must, uses who and what it will and can in an effort to increase its strength and control over all things." Varad again looks all around him, at the vast, dark, empty chamber before again focusing on Vader and finishing, "And it will seek to amass power until it has become absolute, and it is all that remains in an otherwise dark and empty galaxy." It is then that, in the darkness, we can just make out Vader's hands ball up into fists, before he springs to his feet and says, "Tell me why you have come here, or I shall simply destroy you." Varad grins to that and then replies, "We can help each other, you and I, Lord Vader. We both have destinies that were robbed from us." It is then that Varad opens his hand again, and the stone resting in his palm now gives off a brilliant golden glow, and within that glow we can see an image from a great many years ago of Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala being wed on Naboo. Varad then says as he looks upon that image, "Everything you have ever done, from serving Darth Sidious to now trying to bring this entire galaxy to heel, has been done in an effort to correct the failings of a foolish boy who lost that which was more precious to him than all the power the Force itself has to offer." Varad shuts his hand around the stone for a moment, and then opens it again, and now the image in the golden glow is of Padme's apartment on Coruscant, and we see Obi-Wan Kenobi seated next to Padme on a sofa, and briefly hear him telling her about how Anakin has turned to the dark side. That's when we focus in on the helmetless face of Darth Vader, illuminated by that golden glow, and see absolute rage and hatred in his eyes. Varad then closes his hand around the stone again, and when he opens it once more, we now see an odd scene of Padme and Obi-Wan together, smiling and in each other's arms, though we also notice that Obi-Wan's face seems to be horribly scarred and burnt. Varad then says, "You were right all along. He turned her against you, convinced her to go to you on Mustafar so that he could destroy you, and take her for himself." Varad then again closes his hand around the stone, but this time doesn't open it, and instead lets silence and darkness reign for several long seconds, before Vader says, "What is it you propose, then?" We see Varad give a big grin before saying, "I will give us back our destinies. We will enter the world between worlds and send you back in time, where you will destroy Kenobi and allow your younger self to have a future with the woman he loves." Vader then folds his arms and says, "And how will you restore your destiny?" Vader gives an almost careless shrug and says, "You are mortal, Vader, and one way or the other, the darkness is going to consume and destroy you. And, oh, I suppose you could be like Darth Plagueis, or many Sith before him, and seek a way to outrun it, or avoid it, or overcome it. But death will find you. I, however, am not mortal. I am not a part of the Force as you are, but rather, I am something separate. I and the other wills like me existed before it, and gave it shape and purpose in the first place. But unlike the others who decided to let themselves fade away, I decided to endure and find new purpose." Vader says nothing to all that, and so Vader gives a grin and continues, "Kill me and I will return. Imprison me and I will eventually be freed. There is no way to ever be rid of me, Vader. Your son knew this. Luke knew the only way to truly defeat me was to try and appeal to my better side, to hide my true selfish nature from myself, and to turn me into a selfless being who would willingly fade away, as the others of my kind did. He knew that was the only way to ever defeat me." Still, Vader says nothing, so Varad's smile grows even more and he continues, "There is simply no way for you to hold the power you now possess forever. It will ultimately destroy you and be mine again. So be thankful I aid you at all, Vader. Be thankful I allow you to continue to exist and begin to realize that all there is left to do is kneel before me and accept me as the master of the Force." We then switch scenes, and once again get a shot of the Sith Temple on Malachor, before we're again taken inside, where Ben Solo is still using Ahsoka's saber to lead himself and Rey through the darkness. That's when we hear Rey say, "So he never told you or your mother then? Luke never told you about who you really were. Why would he do that?" Ben shrugs as if it doesn't really bother him, but we can tell by the look on his face that it does. He then says, "I would imagine to protect me or my mother or both of us. I mean, if the truth ever came out that Darth Vader was the great Senator Leia Organa's father, it would no doubt destroy her politically." Rey gives a bit of a shrug to that and then says, "It still doesn't explain why he'd block your powers, though. I mean, just because Leia had a son that was strong with the Force doesn't mean everyone would right away assume she was Vader's daughter." Ben pauses for a moment, frowns at that, and then says before continuing on, "I suppose you're right. Whatever reason Luke did it, though, I'm sure it's a good one." We then watch as Rey and Ben negotiate the rooms and corridors of the Sith Temple for a bit, when suddenly the two hear a man's scream. They then look at each other for a moment as if making sure the other also heard it, before they both take off running in the direction the scream apparently came from. And as they run down the corridor, Ben gets a bit in front of Rey, and when he emerges into a large chamber, a stone door immediately slides shut behind him and separates him from Rey. Ben then immediately slams his fist, the one not holding the saber of course, into the door a couple times and screams her name, and then quietly listens for a moment but can hear nothing in response. He then looks at the saber in his hand, then at the door, and seems to consider trying to cut his way through it, before he hears a female voice from behind him say, "How amusing that the child I was just seeing in his mind has decided to join us." Ben then spins around and sees that in the middle of this large stone chamber, lit by a few strange fist-sized crystals that hover about the room and give off an intense crimson-red glow, is an ancient-looking woman wearing black robes, standing over a waist-high stone table where Luke Skywalker lies, seemingly semi-conscious, but apparently unable to move. Ben, after taking it all in for a moment, raises the brilliant white saber, takes a bold step forward and says, "I'm no child. I'm a Jedi, and I demand that you release him." The ancient female Sith lets out a cackling laugh, makes a subtle gesture with her head, and the saber goes flying from Ben's hold. She then says, "You're no Jedi, child, and the only reason you still live is because I believe I can make use of you after what I have learned about you from his mind." She then takes her decrepit old hand and puts it on Luke's forehead and shuts her eyes, causing Luke to cry out in pain. Ben takes another step forward, seems about to once again demand that she let him go, but instead he says, "Tell me, what have you seen in his mind about me?" The ancient Sith removes her hand from Luke's forehead and grins from ear to ear. "Such a curious child, aren't you?" Her grin fades, and she suddenly looks almost sympathetic as she says, "I know why he lied to you, why he will never train you." Ben then echoes those words, "Never train me." The ancient Sith then nods, looks ever more sympathetic, and says, "He knows what you truly are, child, seen your inescapable future when he was once in a place where all possible destinies can be witnessed." Ben shakes his head and says that he doesn't understand. That's when she begins to move around the table and starts to slowly walk towards Ben. She then says, "The dark side has chosen you, child, chosen you to once and for all rid it of one who has forever been its master, a creature called Snoke. It always has been your destiny to destroy him, to take his place and become something more, to usher in a new age of darkness, the likes of which are almost unimaginable." The ancient Sith then quickly looks behind her, where Luke now looks completely unconscious on the table, and then says, "This is why he will not train you, child. This is why he lied to you and blocked your powers. But now, the Force awakens in you, the dark side awakens in you, whether he likes it or not, and you will need someone to show you the ways of it." She then turns around and raises a hand and stretches it out towards Ben, and that is when he and we see Ben Solo sleeping in what appears to be a small hut, and Luke Skywalker is standing over him with an ignited green lightsaber in hand. We then hear the ancient Sith say, "You came here to free him, seeking his guidance. But behold, he has even seen himself destroying you to prevent what you would become." Ben shakes his head, both because he doesn't want to believe it and in an effort to shake the vision away. And then after she finally lowers her hand and the vision ends, Ben says, "Why should I believe anything you tell me or show me?" The ancient Sith shrugs, glances back at Luke, sees that he's still unconscious, and says, "And why should you believe anything he might tell you after lying to you and your mother all these years?" Ben then begins to stare at Luke lying on the table, and that's when she says, "Your feelings are telling you the truth, child. Listen to them. Listen to them and begin to realize he is not the hero you believed him to be your whole life, nor are the Jedi the just and noble order you believe them to be." The ancient Sith then takes a few more steps towards Ben, and now lays an almost comforting hand on his arm and says, "It's time to begin to ask yourself what it is you truly want, child. Is the life of the Jedi for you? Or perhaps you're finally feeling it, a different destiny calling you, your true destiny." At this point, Ben's head snaps around, and he begins to look at the door to the chamber they're in, the door Rey is trapped behind. However, the ancient Sith doesn't seem to realize this, for she says of the saber which is also behind Ben, "Yes, that's it. Take your saber and end him. Embrace your destiny. Destroy Luke Skywalker." Ben vaguely nods his head and then says, Yes, I feel it too. I feel my true destiny." The ancient Sith now smiles and says, "Yes, I feel your resolve, child. I feel you rejecting the path of the Jedi for another." She then reaches out her hand and pulls Ahsoka's saber to her, and she hands it to Ben and says, "Now take up your weapon and strike him down." Ben looks at the saber now in his hand, and then at Luke, then back down at the saber and activates it. He then locks eyes on Luke, looks full of hate and anger, and takes one quick step towards him before immediately spinning around to try and slice the ancient Sith in half, but she was ready for him. And now Ben stands apparently frozen in place, the shimmering white blade of Ahsoka's saber inches away from her torso, for the ancient Sith just as quickly raised her hand and caught him in a force hold. She then shakes her head at him and says, "Your first and only lesson, child, before I break you and wipe all remnants of your pathetic being away and take over your body so I can leave this place, is that we Sith are never foolish enough to trust anyone ever." Ben, though frozen in place, manages to then say, "Sounds like a sad, lonely existence, and now I have a lesson for you. Never turn your back on a Jedi Master." At that, the ancient Sith's eyes go wide, and she manages to look just in time to see that Luke is now sitting up, and she watches him make a quick swiping motion with his hand, breaking the hold she has on Ben, which allows Ben to finish his swing and slice her in half. Ben then lets out a sigh of relief as Luke gives him an approving nod of the head. Ben then takes one step towards Luke, but stops himself and looks over his shoulder at the door Rey is trapped behind. He then turns around and races towards it, and when he reaches it, he yells as loud as he can for her to move away from it, before he begins to, rather carefully, shear away pieces of the stone door until he is able to see her on the other side and make sure that she's not too close to it, before proceeding to hack the rest of the door apart. And when it's out of the way, Rey and Ben embrace in silence, while we focus on Luke and see a look of mixed emotions on his face. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and what might happen next. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.